Okay, picture a Viking. You're probably seeing a giant dirty dude with a horn. So today we're taking a sledgehammer to that cartoon. We're going to demolish 44 of the dumbest, most persistent myths about the Viking Age. And trust me, the historical truth is 1,000 times more absurd. So today we're taking a sledgehammer to that cartoon. 1. Let's start with the big one. The fashion statement to end all fashion statements. The horned helmet. This is, and I can't stress this enough, complete and utter baloney. Vikings did not wear horned helmets. It's like saying all Americans wear cowboy hats and ride eagles to work. The whole look was cooked up for an opera in the 1800s because nothing says, "I'm the bad guy," like impractical headgear. Just imagine trying to function with those things. You'd be a menace in a shield wall, constantly hooking your buddy Steve in the eye. You couldn't get through a doorway. Forget fighting, you couldn't even raid a pantry for snacks without causing chaos. Real Viking helmets were simple, effective, and horn-free. They were there to stop you from dying, not to make you look like a deer. 2. This myth of the grimy, stinky Viking who smelled like a wet dog that rolled in garbage is just plain wrong. In reality, the Norse were the clean freaks of the Dark Ages. Archaeologists keep finding their personal grooming kits, which were basically the Swiss Army knives of hygiene. Fancy combs, tweezers, razors, even little ear spoons. Can you imagine a 7-foot-tall warrior meticulously cleaning his ears? They bathed weekly on Laugardagr, or washing day, which we now call Saturday. English writers at the time basically wrote diary entries, complaining that these ridiculously clean, well-groomed Viking dudes were showing up, and all the local women were suddenly swooning. They didn't win people over with brute force. They won with good hygiene and great hair. 3. Every Viking in the movies is built like a refrigerator and is at least 6'5". The reality is a little more down to earth. The average Viking dude was about 5'7", which for the time was perfectly respectable, but it's not exactly the giant Superman squad we picture. And they weren't all blonde bombshells either. These guys traveled, traded, and mingled everywhere. So you had a whole mix of blondes, brunettes, and redheads. But here's the kicker. Some of them wanted to be blonde so badly they bleached their hair with a super harsh soap made of lye. Not only did it give them that sun-kissed look, but it also murdered all their head lice. It was the ultimate medieval 2-for-1, a killer hairstyle that was also a pesticide. 4. Viking nicknames sound so incredibly cool. Ivar the Boneless, Eric Bloodaxe, Harold Bluetooth. You just assume they earned these names by doing something impossibly epic. Nope. These were basically brutally honest roast sessions from their friends. These names were often just literal and sometimes mean descriptions. Got a weirdly flat nose? Welcome to being called Olaf Flatnose for the rest of your life. A little on the hairy side? Get ready to answer to Bjorn the Shaggy. The legendary Ivar the Boneless could have meant anything from a guy with a bone disease to being incredibly flexible. Or it could have been a savage joke about his performance in the bedroom. Imagine being the most feared warrior on the seas, and your nickname is basically a giant L from your buddies. 5. The Berserkers. The story goes that these guys would chug a magic potion, and poof, they'd turn into grizzly bears on the battlefield. As awesome as that sounds, it's not quite what happened. Berserker means bear shirt or bear shirt, which meant these warriors went into battle wearing either animal skins or, even crazier, basically no armor at all. They weren't shape-shifting. They were just entering a state of pure, unadulterated rage. Think of it as the original beast mode. Whether it was from sketchy mushrooms, way too much mead, or just an extreme form of battle-induced adrenaline, these guys were terrifying. They were the human equivalent of a tornado, the special ops troops you unleashed when you absolutely positively had to freak everybody out. 6. The shield wall. In every TV show, it's this unbreakable, impenetrable wall of death, a moving fortress that just steamrolls everything in its path. And while it was an absolutely brilliant and terrifying tactic, it wasn't a magical force field. It was a wall made of wood, sweat, and very nervous men. A well-organized cavalry charge could crack it. A hail of arrows from above could turn the guys in the back into pincushions. A clever enemy could just run around the side and start poking the vulnerable bits. It was a high-stakes game of human dominoes. All it took was one guy, probably named Kevin, to trip over a rock, and the whole glorious formation could come crashing down in a very messy, very pointy pile. 7. The idea that Viking combat was just a chaotic free-for-all of screaming lunatics swinging axes is an insult to their genius. These guys were some of the slickest military minds of their day. Their signature move wasn't just swinging hard, it was the feigned retreat. They would pretend to get scared and run away, screaming like they just saw a ghost. Their enemies, puffed up with pride, would break formation and chase after them. And just when they thought they'd won, the Vikings would turn around and absolutely demolish them. It was the ultimate psych maneuver of the Dark Ages. They were masters of psychological warfare and amphibious assaults. They weren't just brutes. They were cunning, tactical pranksters whose pranks usually ended with you losing a limb. 8. Being a Viking wasn't a full-time job with benefits and a 401k plan. If all they did was raid, their entire civilization would have starved to death in about 6 months. The overwhelming majority of Norse people were just people. They were farmers worrying about their crops, blacksmiths trying to get an order done, and merchants haggling over the price of fish. The whole raiding thing was more like a very high-risk summer job for young guys looking to make a name for themselves and score enough loot to buy a farm and settle down. Think of it as the most extreme gap year imaginable. For most of the year, Leif was tending his sheep. But for 2 weeks in July, he was on a business trip to the English coast. 9. This next one is a heavy metal album cover come to life. The idea that Vikings chugged mead from the hollowed-out skulls of their enemies. While it sounds incredibly hardcore, it's also incredibly stupid and, thankfully, not true. This whole myth comes from a simple misunderstanding, a mistranslation of an Old Norse poem. The text described heroes drinking from the curved branches of skulls, which was a poetic way of saying they were drinking from horns. You know, like animal horns, which actually make pretty decent cups. Imagine the sheer impracticality of a skull cup. They're lumpy, full of weird holes, and I can't even begin to imagine the cleaning process. It's not a cup, it's a leaky, gruesome mess. No self-respecting Viking would deal with that. They had stuff to do. 10. Thanks to TV shows, we now picture the Viking world as being packed with shieldmaidens, warrior women who were basically medieval superheroines fighting on the front lines in every battle. And while we all love a good story about a fierce warrior queen, the reality was a bit more grounded. Yes, there is evidence that some women fought as warriors. A few graves containing female remains and weapons have been found. But this was the exception, not the rule. It wasn't a common career path. Most women ran the farms, managed households and businesses, and held the entire society together while the men were off on their business trips. The idea of entire armies of shield maidens is a fantasy. It wasn't a co-ed gladiator school. It was a tough society where a few exceptional women likely broke the mold. But they were rare legends, not everyday soldiers. 11. Here's a shocker. Not every Viking man was a warrior. Just like not every Italian is a gourmet chef, and not every Canadian apologizes constantly. Society just doesn't work that way. For every terrifying raider named Olaf the Skull Splitter, there had to be a dozen other guys back home. Guys like Finn the shipbuilder, Magnus the farmer, and probably even a Gary the guy who's weirdly good at weaving. You need people to make the boats, forge the weapons, grow the food, and brew the ale. An army of nothing but warriors would be a very hungry, very naked army with no way to get anywhere. Being a warrior was a high-status profession, but it was just one piece of a complex and functioning society that included poets, blacksmiths, merchants, and farmers. 12. If you traveled back in time and called a random Norse farmer a Viking, he'd probably just give you a confused look. They didn't identify themselves that way. The word Viking wasn't a noun for a person, it was a verb for an activity. To go a Viking meant to go on a raid or a sea journey. It was a job description, not an entire cultural identity. It's like calling someone an expedition goer. A man from Norway was a Norseman. A man from Denmark was a Dane. He might go a Viking in the summer for some extra cash and adventure, but that didn't define his entire existence. It was a part of their world, but not the name for their whole team. 13. We tend to think of the Viking world as one big, unified empire called Scandinavia, with all the Vikings holding hands and singing raiding shanties together. That couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the region was a chaotic, messy collection of dozens of petty kingdoms and rival chieftains. Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians were all distinct groups, and they were just as likely to fight each other as they were to raid a monastery in England. There was no single Viking king or unified nation. It was more like a season of Game of Thrones, but with more fjords and slightly better helmets. The idea of a single, unified Viking identity is a modern simplification of a very complicated and divided political landscape. 14. The image of Vikings as lawless brutes who solved every disagreement with an axe to the face is a wild exaggeration. They actually had a surprisingly sophisticated legal system. Most communities were governed by a local assembly called a thing. This was an open-air meeting where free men would gather to make laws, settle disputes, and pass judgments. It was like the world's most intense town hall meeting. Instead of arguing about zoning permits, they were debating things like property inheritance and punishment for crimes. They had law speakers who had to memorize the entire legal code. It wasn't just brute force, it was a society built on laws, contracts, and a shared sense of justice, even if that justice was sometimes enforced with an axe. 15. Another common myth is that Viking women were meek, powerless property of their husbands. This is so wrong it's almost funny. Viking-age women in Scandinavia had more rights than almost any other women in Europe at the time. They could own property, inherit land, and run businesses. And here's the best part. They could initiate a divorce. A woman could divorce her husband for being lazy, for failing to provide, or, and this is a real law, for wearing a shirt that showed too much chest hair, which was considered effeminate. Can you imagine? A fierce warrior getting served divorce papers because his V-neck was too deep. It shows they weren't just voiceless bystanders, they had agency, power, and very high standards. 16. The Flaming Longship Funeral. It is the single most epic and cinematic send-off in history. A warrior's body, set adrift in his magnificent ship, engulfed in flames as it sails into the sunset. It's beautiful, poetic, and also almost never happened. A longship was the medieval equivalent of a fighter jet and a cargo freighter combined. It took thousands of man-hours and immense resources to build. You simply do not burn your most valuable piece of technology every time someone kicks the bucket. That's like setting fire to a Lamborghini for a funeral. This kind of spectacular farewell was reserved for the most powerful kings or legendary chieftains. For your average Viking, a burial on land, sometimes in a grave marked with stones in the shape of a ship, was the standard, much more practical procedure. 17. Let's talk about runes. We think of them as this super mystical, magical alphabet used for casting spooky curses and seeing the future. In reality, runes were just letters. They were the Viking ABCs. Using runes to cast a spell would be like trying to curse your neighbor by aggressively carving "owe me $5" on a piece of wood. The vast majority of rune stones we've found are basically just medieval graffiti, memorials, or business ledgers. Things like Ingrid made these runes, or Halfdan was here. Sure, some people probably believed they had magical properties, just like some people today believe in lucky numbers. But their primary function was writing. It was a practical alphabet for a practical people, not a wizard's spellbook. 18. The idea that all Vikings lived in miserable little mud huts is just sad and wrong. It paints a picture of a people constantly shivering in the dark. The truth is, they lived in massive, impressive wooden structures called longhouses. These weren't huts. They were like giant, multi-generational party barns. One long building could house an entire extended family, their workers, and even their livestock for the winter. It was the original open-concept living space, with a long fire pit down the center for warmth and cooking. It was a bustling, smoky, probably very loud community hub. They weren't cowering in the mud. They were living in giant, custom-built log cabins with all their friends and some of their favorite cows. 19. When we think of a Viking ship, we picture the Drakr, that sleek, terrifying dragon-headed warship designed for speed and surprise attacks. But to think that was their only boat is like thinking a modern army only uses fighter jets. It's completely impractical. The Drakr was the Viking sports car, fast, cool, and terrible for hauling cargo. For all the boring but essential work like trading, moving supplies, or hauling Aunt Helga's new set of looms, they had the Gnar. The Gnar was the minivan of the Viking world. It was wide, deep, and slow, built to carry tons of goods, not to look scary. They were brilliant engineers who built the right tool for the right job, and sometimes that job was less raiding a coastline and more transporting a whole lot of dried fish. 20. Every movie feast shows Vikings tearing into giant legs of meat and drinking gallons of mead. This all-meat, all-the-time diet is a theme park fantasy. In reality, their diet was surprisingly balanced and healthy. They were farmers, after all. Their daily meals consisted of things like grains for porridge and bread, vegetables from their gardens like cabbage and beans, and lots of dairy products like cheese and skyr, which is like a thick yogurt. Fish was a huge staple, obviously. Meat and mead were expensive treats, reserved for feasts and special occasions. For the most part, they were eating a sensible, locally sourced diet that modern nutritionists would probably approve of. Less barbarian feast, more ancient Scandinavian health food craze. 21. There's a tendency to romanticize Vikings and gloss over the darker parts of their society. A common misconception is that slavery wasn't a big deal for them, that it was rare or somehow less harsh. This is dangerously incorrect. The slave trade was a massive and absolutely brutal cornerstone of the Viking economy. They didn't just steal gold, they stole people. These individuals, whom they called thralls, were captured in raids across Europe and had no rights whatsoever. They were bought and sold at major slave markets, like the one in Dublin, which was founded by Vikings. This wasn't a minor detail of their culture. It was a fundamental, cruel industry that built a significant portion of their wealth and powered their expansion. It's a grim reality that stands in stark contrast to the heroic image we often see. 22. In stories, every Viking warrior seems to be wielding a legendary named sword that can cut through steel and probably time itself. This is the Viking equivalent of thinking everyone today drives a Bugatti. In reality, a good sword, like the famous Ulfberht blades, was an incredibly rare and astronomically expensive piece of high technology. It was a status symbol, the ultimate bling for a high-ranking chieftain. Your average warrior, the guy in the third row of the shield wall, could never afford one. He was showing up to the battle with much more common and affordable weapons: a sturdy spear, a shield, and a trusty axe. The axe was the great equalizer. It was a cheap, effective, and brutal tool that doubled as a weapon. Most Vikings fought and died with an axe or spear in hand, not a mythical super sword. 23. The legendary Viking sunstone has been mythologized into a magical GPS device, a glowing crystal that pointed the way to new lands. The reality is both less magical and infinitely more clever. Sunstones were likely real, but they weren't fantasy artifacts. They were specific types of crystals, like calcite, that have a property called birefringence. This means they polarize light. On a gray, hopelessly overcast day when you couldn't see the sun, a skilled navigator could hold one up to the sky and rotate it. By observing the light patterns through the crystal, they could pinpoint the sun's hidden position with surprising accuracy. It was a brilliant, low-tech navigational tool based on pure physics. Not magic, but a genius scientific hack that helped them master the northern seas. 24. Another dumb myth is that Vikings were essentially seafaring nomads who just lived on their boats and never put down roots. This couldn't be more wrong. These guys weren't just visitors. They were founders and city builders. They didn't just raid places, they took them over. settled down, and started their own bustling towns. They established some of the most important trading hubs in European history. The city of Dublin in Ireland, founded by Vikings. The city of York in England, they conquered it, renamed it Jorvik, and turned it into their northern capital. They sailed rivers deep into Eastern Europe and played a key role in the founding of cities like Kiev. They weren't just marauders, they were explorers, settlers, and urban planners with a very aggressive expansion policy. 25. This idea of one single, all-powerful Viking king ruling over everyone from a giant throne is a complete fantasy. It's like thinking there's one CEO of the entire internet. The reality was way more chaotic and, frankly, more entertaining. The Viking world was a messy patchwork of territories ruled by dozens of petty kings and ambitious chieftains who were constantly bickering, backstabbing, and fighting over land and influence. It was less of a unified empire and more like a high school cafeteria where all the popular kids have armies and terrible impulse control. One chieftain would get powerful, and his neighbors would immediately form an alliance to take him down a peg. It was a non-stop drama of shifting loyalties and brutal politics, which makes their accomplishments even more impressive. 26. Getting into Valhalla wasn't the guaranteed participation trophy we think it was. The sales pitch was great. Die bravely in battle and you get to go to Odin's eternal warrior paradise. But people tend to skip the fine print. First of all, Odin didn't even get everyone. He only got to pick half of the warriors who died in battle. The other half went to the goddess Freya's field, Folkvanger, which was apparently also a pretty sweet afterlife spot. So right off the bat, it's a coin toss. And it wasn't for just any guy who tripped and fell on his spear. It was for the best of the best. Imagine a bouncer at the gates of Valhalla checking your combat resume. It was an exclusive club for the warrior elite, not a general admission ticket for every soldier. 27. The idea that the Vikings just vanished off the face of the earth around the year 1066 is one of history's silliest myths. They didn't get beamed up by aliens or mysteriously disappear. They just got really, really good at fitting in. They were victims of their own success. Vikings who settled in France became the Normans. Vikings who settled in England just became English. The ones who went to Russia blended into the Slavic populations. They didn't vanish. They assimilated. They hung up their raiding axes, married local women, and their kids grew up speaking the local language. They were so good at adapting that within a few generations they had effectively blended into the cultures they had once terrorized. They didn't disappear. They just got jobs and moved to the suburbs. 28. This myth of Vikings being totally isolated barbarians who had no idea what was going on in the rest of the world is hilariously wrong. These guys got around more than anyone. They were the original globetrotters, the ultimate networkers of the Dark Ages. They weren't just stuck in Scandinavia. They established a mind-bogglingly vast trade network that stretched from North America to the Middle East. They sailed down rivers to trade in Constantinople, and their merchants were haggling in the markets of Baghdad. They were bringing back Arab silver, Byzantine silks, and Indian spices. They were more connected to the global economy than half the kingdoms in Europe. Calling them isolated is like calling Amazon a small local bookstore. 29. The Holmgang, the formal Viking duel, sounds like the most terrifying thing ever. A fight to the death on a small island to settle a dispute. But it wasn't always the brutal deathmatch we imagine. It was a formal legal procedure, and very often, it wasn't to the death at all. Many holmgangs were fought to first blood. The moment one guy got a decent cut, the fight was over and the legal dispute was settled. Imagine two giant bearded warriors swinging axes, and the whole thing ends because one of them gets a nasty scrape on his forearm. It was a way to prove you were serious and willing to risk your skin, but it was often more about honor and legal standing than outright murder. It was a lawsuit, just with a much higher chance of needing stitches. 30. We picture every Viking as a fearless fanatic with a death wish, waking up every morning hoping to get gloriously slain in battle. Let's be real for a second. These were human beings. They had families. They liked drinking ale. They probably enjoyed watching a nice sunset. While their culture did glorify a heroic death in battle as the best possible way to go, that doesn't mean they were actively suicidal. They were professional warriors, which means their primary goal was to win and come home alive. Valuing a good death is very different from wanting to die. They were probably just as scared as anyone else before a battle. They were just incredibly well trained and had a cultural framework that helped them push through that fear. 31. Let's clear this one up. Leif Erikson did not discover a completely empty America. You can't discover a place where people are already living. That's not called discovery, it's called showing up unannounced. When the Norse landed in what is now Newfoundland around the year 1000, they found a land that was already home to indigenous peoples whom the Vikings called Skrælings. It wasn't an empty paradise waiting for them, it was someone else's neighborhood. The Vikings even tried to set up a small settlement, but interactions with the locals didn't go well, and they eventually packed up and left. They were the first Europeans to reach the Americas, which is incredible, but they certainly weren't the first people there. 32. Forget the drab, boring image of Vikings dressed only in 50 shades of brown leather and dirty animal fur. That's a Hollywood invention to make them look gritty and miserable. The real Vikings loved color. They were flashy. Archaeological finds, including scraps of fabric, show that they wore vibrant clothes. They used plant-based dyes to make rich reds, yellows, and especially blues. A specific shade of blue from the woad plant was so popular it was practically a status symbol. They adorned their clothes with intricate embroidery and shiny bits of metal. They looked less like post-apocalyptic bikers and more like a traveling medieval fashion show. They were proud of their appearance and used bright, bold colors to show off their wealth and status. 33. Let's talk about the Viking gods. We tend to think of their religion as the Odin and Thor show, with Freya as a special guest star. But boiling their faith down to just those three is like saying the only animals in the zoo are a lion, a bear, and a giraffe. The Norse pantheon was a sprawling, chaotic, and downright weird family reunion of deities. There was a god for practically everything. You had Tyr, the one-handed god of justice, Njord, the god of sailors who had really beautiful feet for some reason, and even Skadi, a goddess of skiing and hunting. It was a complex web of gods, elves, dwarves, and giants. Focusing only on the big names ignores the rich, bizarre tapestry of their actual beliefs. 34. This one breaks our modern brains. Vikings didn't have last names like we do. Leif Erikson wasn't Mr. Erikson. That name simply means Leif, the son of Eric. His own son, Thorkel, wouldn't be Thorkel Erikson. He'd be Thorkel Leifson. His daughter would be, say, Astrid Leifsdottir, or daughter of Leif. It was a patronymic system, where your last name was just your dad's first name with son or daughter tacked on the end. This means a family's name changed every single generation. Imagine trying to build a family tree. It would be an absolute nightmare of genealogical chaos. It makes you appreciate how simple and boring our modern naming system is. 35. We've established they were surprisingly clean, but this next myth is about why. The story that they were just inherently more hygienic is only half the picture. The real reason they were so obsessed with grooming might have been a strategic weapon in the dating world. English writers from the period complained bitterly that these Viking invaders were bathing every Saturday, combing their luscious hair, and wearing clean, colorful clothes. The result? They were incredibly popular with Anglo-Saxon noblewomen. It was a hostile takeover not just of land, but of the entire social scene. While the local lords were still figuring out basic hygiene, the Vikings showed up looking like rock stars, and it worked. 36. The image of every single Viking warrior marching into battle with a shiny metal helmet is another movie invention. A well-made steel helmet in the Viking Age was the equivalent of a high-end luxury good. It was incredibly expensive and time-consuming to make. Only the wealthy chieftains, professional warriors, and the richest guys in the warband could afford one. Your average farmer, conscripted for a fight, was probably going into battle wearing a thick leather or wool cap, or just trusting in his thick skull and a whole lot of prayer. A metal helmet wasn't standard issue. It was a status symbol that screamed, "Hey everyone, I'm important. Please don't hit me in the head with an axe. This thing was expensive." 37. This myth paints Vikings as one-dimensional pirates who only left home to steal shiny things and cause problems. While they were exceptionally good at that, it was only part of their business model. They were, first and foremost, master traders and merchants. They didn't just take stuff, they created vast commercial networks. Imagine a Viking ship's itinerary. Monday, raid a French monastery. Tuesday, sail to a market in England and sell the aggressively acquired silverware. Wednesday, use the profits to buy English wool to sell in Denmark. They were less like mindless thugs and more like ruthless entrepreneurs with an incredibly aggressive acquisitions department and a very flexible moral code. 38. It's easy to label the Vikings as the most brutal and violent people of their time, but that's giving them way too much credit. The Viking Age was a violent time for absolutely everyone. They weren't an anomaly, they were just part of the trend. Famous, civilized rulers like Charlemagne were committing massacres that would make a Viking raider blush. The Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, the Slavs, everyone was constantly fighting, betraying, and conquering each other. The Vikings just had a significant advantage: superior boats. This gave them incredible mobility and a great PR team of terrified monks who wrote down everything they did. They weren't necessarily more brutal, they just had better away game performance. 39. The idea that Vikings were just grunting brutes with no appreciation for art is completely ridiculous. These guys were obsessed with poetry. A great poet, or skald, was as famous and respected as a legendary warrior. Their poetry wasn't simple rhymes. It was incredibly complex, with strict meter and syllable counts and layers of intricate metaphors called kennings. They'd call a sword a wound snake, or the sea the whale road. They also carved stunningly intricate designs into everything: their ships, their weapons, their jewelry, even everyday objects. They were warriors, yes, but they were also artists and poets who would chop your head off and then compose a beautiful, structurally perfect poem about the experience. 40. We think of Viking as an exclusive club, something you had to be born into. But that's not how it worked. It was more like a profession, and they were surprisingly open to new applicants. The primary qualification for joining a Viking warband wasn't your ancestry. It was your ability to fight and your loyalty to the leader. There's plenty of historical and archaeological evidence of people from other cultures, Slavs, Irish, Franks, fighting alongside the Norse. If you were tough, useful, and willing to share the loot, you were in. It was an equal opportunity employer, as long as the opportunity you were looking for was high-risk maritime raiding with a chance of immense wealth or a very pointy death. 41. The concept of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, often gets twisted into the idea that Vikings lived in constant fear of an impending apocalypse. This wasn't the case. Ragnarok wasn't a "the world ends next Tuesday" prophecy. It was a foundational myth about the ultimate destiny of the cosmos. It was a story that said that everything, even the gods themselves, has an end. But it also told of a rebirth, a new world rising from the ashes of the old. It gave their universe a sense of tragic grandeur, but it didn't make them doomsday preppers. They still had to plant their crops, build their ships, and live their lives, knowing that the final battle was a far-off, cosmic event, not a weather forecast. 42. You'd expect Viking teeth to be a horrifying mess, but their low-sugar diet actually kept them healthier than many other Europeans. But here's where it gets truly weird. Archaeologists have found numerous skulls, mostly belonging to warriors, with deep horizontal grooves intentionally filed into their front teeth. This wasn't decay. This was deliberate, painful body modification. Even crazier, traces of pigment in these grooves suggest they were filled with colors like red or black. So forget bad teeth. These guys had custom striped fangs. It was likely a form of psychological warfare, a terrifying grill designed to intimidate their enemies in battle. Imagine a warrior smiling at you before a fight, revealing a mouthful of colored stripes. 43. Every movie raid looks like a massive invasion, with hundreds of dragon-headed longships covering the horizon. While huge fleets like the Great Heathen Army did exist, they were the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of Viking raids were small-scale, opportunistic affairs. Think one or two ships, crewed by a few dozen guys, making a lightning-fast strike on a poorly defended coastal village or monastery. It was the Viking equivalent of a smash and grab. Get in, take what you can carry, and get out before any organized resistance can show up. It was less about conquest and more about profitable, low-risk piracy. 44. The final weapon myth, the giant two-handed battle axe. While the massive Dane axe was a real and terrifying weapon, it was not the standard issue tool of your average Viking. That thing was a specialized weapon for elite, heavily armored warriors, the guys in the front rank who didn't need a shield because their job was to be a human can opener. For the common warrior, the undisputed king of the battlefield was the spear. Spears were cheap to produce, easy to use, and incredibly effective, especially when packed together in a shield wall. The axe was iconic, but the spear did most of the actual work. So, there you have it. The horned, filthy, uncultured barbarian we all think we know is mostly a work of fiction. The real Viking was a more complex, more colorful, and frankly, a more bizarre character than any myth could capture. They were clean, law-abiding, poetry-loving traders who just happened to be lethally good at raiding. Now we have to ask, after hearing all this, which historical figure or group do you think gets an even worse or more inaccurate reputation than they deserve? Let the great debate begin in the comments below. And if you enjoyed getting your historical myths busted, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more truths that are stranger than fiction.